Andy Geers, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with a Facebook post that you posted, I think, sometime at the end of 2023. In the post, you said that you spent nearly 19 and a half years trying to build a Bible-based video game. Why?
Yeah, well, that is
Why
a really
is it
good
so
question.
important to you?
Yeah. So yeah, I was kind of digging into my old blog in order to make that video that I'd made, and I found my kind of original like announcement post back on my live journal. Can you believe it? That's how old it was. Back in January 2005, and I'd been to this sort of youth worker conference. And we'd studied the book of Ruth, and it's like a really short little story in the Bible. But I came away so kind of encouraged by all these amazing truths I'd learned about God's character. And I think it really kind of amazed me and sort of taught me, I suppose, that stories can be so powerful for teaching us about God. And I'd grown up playing loads of story-based games, so particularly like the Monkey Island games were the ones that were kind of in mind at the time, and I just thought, wouldn't it be great to sort of use a story-based game like that, but to teach a story about God? And I thought it could be a great way of engaging people who perhaps wouldn't normally read the Bible, or people who like less committed to reading the Bible anyway. And it's a really fun way to learn about God. So that kind of kicked off my journey. I didn't really have much experience of successfully making games by that point. I'd spent most of my life trying to make games and failing. So I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have any money or experience or skills or anything, just this passion really. And I spent about 10 years trying to pursue that kind of Monkey Island based, so point and click adventure game about one particular Bible story. I think originally I probably was trying to do David and Goliath, which is a bit cliched, and I sort of thought, oh, everyone tries to make David and Goliath games. So I eventually settled on going a few chapters earlier to 1 Samuel, sort of 8 to 12, where Saul becomes king. And it was hard, really, really hard. And it felt like at every single stage, it was like trying to get blood out of the stone. Like I think I quickly realized that like games like Monkey Island, so many of the puzzles are based around like stealing something or deceiving someone, or just generally doing things that you probably don't want to incorporate into a kind of Christian game like that. So coming up with puzzles that were interesting and yet still kind of funny and engaging, just really hard. Yeah, I had some friends who helped me to meet up like once a month for a drink and a kind of a session of trying to figure out some puzzles. But even with their help, 10 years in, I still just felt I was getting nowhere, and kind of it really just fizzled out.
What's your background? Like, are you a developer?
Yeah, so I've been like programming computers since I was about 5. My dad bought me this magazine called Let's Compute, which is sort of teaching kids how to code. And unsurprisingly, it went bust after about 12 issues, I think. But I've always been into coding, so I've loved that. And so most of my professional career has been as a software developer. I think I did, like, in order to pursue this Christian game idea or Bible-based game idea, I did sort of try my best to get a job in the games industry, but it never really worked out. So I ended up in sort of web development mainly, so working for like a newspaper company or a visual effects company or a food delivery company, so all sorts of different places. But yeah.
And how long have you been in the CGDC?
Yeah, well, I suppose pretty early on, I thought, well, there must be other people out there with a kind of interest in making Bible-based games like this. So sort of found the Christian Developers Network back in the day, and I went to the Christian Game Developers Conference when it was in Oregon back in 2011. I think there was sort of the kind of climax of those efforts to make that game about 1 Samuel. I think I'd got a sort of a bit of a kind of prototype of a game, so I flew out to Oregon to show it to people, and that's where I met a few people in the community and things like that. But ironically, that was really just at the point that I was sort of starting to give up on that idea. So I haven't been back since, until last year, when I was able to kind of bring our latest project, the Serpent and the Seed, and engage with people again.
So talk about that period between the two games.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened is I had this sort of 10-day sort of holiday. I was studying at Bible college at that point, and
Okay.
I've met with my prayer group at Bible college who, like, they were very patient with me. Week by week, I was saying, "Oh, pray for this computer game I'm trying to make," and obviously I was going nowhere fast. And I said to them, "I've got this 10-day break. I could just put another 10 days into the game, and or I've got this other idea for a project, which is I really want to make an app to help people pray." And they asked me a few questions about that idea, and in the end, they said, "We think you should give this prayer app idea a go." So I spent those 10 days building the app, which would become PrayerMate, which by the end of 10 days, I actually had a fully working prototype. Within a month, it was live on the App Store, and within a couple of years, it had about 100,000 downloads. And
Oh wow.
That just really took off in a way that the game never did, and increasingly it felt like I was a lot more kind of return on my investment for time spent on that, and so yeah, I suppose that's why the game sort of fell by the wayside a little bit. And it's been such a blessing working on that, to work on a project that is actually helping people, and sort of getting emails from people saying how it's helped them in their relationship with God, and so that's just been a real blessing. And through that, I've actually, after a few years, it became evident that deserved a lot more of my full-time attention, and so I went full-time on PrayerMate in 2016, in large part supported by kind of donations from users of the app. And through that, we set up a charity, Discipleship Tech. Even when I founded the charity, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, like, PrayerMate is great, but I would love at least the sort of flexibility to circle back to the game idea. So we kind of gave it a slightly broader remit of using technology to help people get to know God better, was our sort of tagline. That's gone from strength to strength, and there's a little team working with me on PrayerMate as well. So I have another full-time developer and a user support person, and so that in the last few years, that really sort of gave me the flexibility and the freedom to then sort of, as that's reached a point of maturity, I suppose, take a step back and say, right, well, maybe I can consider other projects like now, and maybe maybe the time is right to sort of think about this game idea once again.
So did it feel like your dream died for a while?
Yeah, in all honesty, I think there definitely were moments where I thought, it felt hard, definitely. I'd been so kind of convinced that this was it really felt like a kind of God-given vision, that I had such a heart for doing it. I remained as convinced as ever that it kind of could work, and if done well, it'd be brilliant. I'd had various other kind of ideas along the way, which eventually actually did become like the Serpent and the Seed. But I think in many ways, I just didn't have quite that appetite to think about it anymore in a way that it had been pretty all-consuming in the early days, and the thought of returning to that just didn't excite me or appeal. So yeah, I it it I suppose what reignited it was, during the lockdown, in 2020. I took part in a hackathon. Faith Tech ran this thing called the Global Church COVID hackathon, I think, something like that. And we worked with a local charity here called Cross Teach, who normally they would go into schools and run these things called they do regular like weekly Bible clubs and stuff, but they would
Mm.
also do these big events at Christmas and Easter called the Christmas experience and the Easter experience, and their Easter experience was like a interactive. It was like a murder mystery version of the Easter story. So they have these different crime scenes, like there's this victim has been killed, so you go to the victim's last meal with his friends, and
Mm.
one was the garden, and I think there was the trial and the grave, and you sort of interview the eyewitnesses, and there's all these different people who like could be responsible, like his friend who was going to betray him, or the judge who convicted him even though he was innocent, and the soldier who thrust the spear into his side to finally kill him. But there's a twist as you discover it's actually all about Jesus, and God had a plan all along and that kind of stuff. So it was really fun. But during COVID, they obviously couldn't go into schools to do this in person. And my
Mhm.
wife had the idea of could we build a kind of digital online web version of this. And we had a lot of fun over basically within a month we built the whole thing from start to finish. And that was just like well, we had so much fun doing it, but it was also just a real eye opener that if you get the scope of your project right, and if you kind of choose your art style carefully, and like it doesn't have to take 10 years to fail to make a computer game. Like you can actually
Yeah.
do something meaningful in a sort of short time period. And yeah, that I think that just that the little spark kind of came alive again of like, oh yeah, maybe this is something that I've probably learnt a few things along the way that make it a bit more feasible now.
I think it's kind of really common. We see it in the Bible too. Like, um, God gives you a dream, and then for a period, it seems like it dies.
Mm,
I also tried to get into games like as soon as I could, but it felt like the door just kept shutting for various reasons. So
mm,
I also took a kind of a side journey. I started a design studio and did that for about a decade, and then eventually was able to get into games. But I feel like personally, I've had to lay my dream of making games down a few times, and it's been painful and hard.
mm,
But then God has had me like pick it back up after I've laid it at His feet.
mm,
It's something that uh, I don't know. I don't know if we talk enough about it. People don't have a linear path, right? Like God's
yeah,
meandering all over and teaching us things and cutting on us and preparing us.
mm,
And I just think of like the story of Joseph and
mm,
Abraham and Moses. Like they're like this messy journeys with twists and
mm, mm,
turns, and but God
yeah,
works it all out in the end.
definitely. I've always loved that story of Joseph, especially like yeah, and that came to mind for me too when you were mentioning that. Like, he's got that dream early on, doesn't he, of like the people bowing down to him, but um, it's a he has to go to get shipped into slavery and spend years in prison, and like he has to do a lot of growing up before he's ready to be used by God, doesn't he? And um,
Yeah.
I think I suppose there is a certain naivety that came with that vision when I was like I thought, oh, I'm the perfect person to do this with my sort of background in both sort of trying to make games, my love of games anyway, and my kind of coding skills. But um, I suppose you're not really ever aware of how much you don't know, do you? And like I just I it's quite a skill learning how to finish a project, and
Yeah.
like I had never finished anything in my life, so I think it's I had a lot to learn before I could really pursue that.
So let's talk about your app. Is your app? It sounds like it's the success of your app is actually enabling you to work on your game now, right?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, like from a purely financial point of view,
Mm-hmm.
the app is really what sort of is the main. provider for our charity, I suppose. Like, you know,
Well,
through the, like, there's a mixture of churches and charities can pay a subscription to share prayer
mhm.
feeds through the app, but then also people who benefit from the app who then donate. So yeah, that basically pays my salary, um, uh,
Oh,
um, and it's also, you know, through the charitable structure. Through that, we've been able to raise various charitable grants that have then funded the game project. Um, but I think, yeah, I mean, in a sort of softer skills kind of sense, it's very much through developing that app that I've learned a lot more about the process of, like, how do you actually take an idea through to fulfillment. I mean, because, you know, even adding a single feature to an app
mhm.
is is a project in its own right, isn't it? You know, you have to come up with
Yeah.
the idea, you kind of plan. There's always a million different ways you could sort of skin a cat in terms of
Mhm.
uh, like how we're going to approach adding that feature, um, and then pursuing that through to completion, um, and then marketing it. I suppose getting, you know, it's not enough to add a feature. You need to persuade your users to try it out and use it and support it and stuff. So I think sort of so I started it in 2011. Started this game project. It was about 10 years basically between. I had 10 years of working on PrayerMate before coming back to the game idea. So I think, yeah, along the way I'd learned a lot of really important, valuable skills about, yeah, completing projects.
So it sounds like you picked up a lot of skills. Um, in addition to that, what's different now? Do you feel like you have some more anointing for it, or some things have changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a coming together of things.
Uh,
I think without a shadow of a doubt, I could not have made the game we're making now 20
uh,
years ago.
mm,
Um, I think I think back then I was trying to make a very kind of different type of game. Like, I wouldn't say
mm,
exactly a kind of really literal game. I always knew it needed something. Like, games have to be fun, don't they? And I think in the case of Monkey Island, it's the humor and the sort of comedy of it that makes it fun. So I suppose even then, it's not like I was going to do a really straight telling of the Bible story. I thought, but it was probably going to be a little bit more literal. I think I've kind of grown as a person, and yeah, I think this project we're pursuing now is a lot more sort of poetic, and there's a lot more kind of imagery, and got some really amazing music from some team called Poor Bishop Hooper, who it's yeah, really kind of stunning music and stuff. But I think a lot of that has come from maturity that I lacked 20 years ago. I don't think I would have been able to make this kind of game. So I think there's definitely that side of things. I think it was also like connections, and a lot of the people we're working on this game, like some of them actually I did meet during my last kind of attempt to make a game. So
mm,
we've been really privileged to work with a game designer called Dan Gould, who uh, he was a game designer for some sort of AAA studios, and then he left that to go to theological college and became a missionary for a while, and now for the last decade or so has been working as a freelance graphic designer, really. But um, he was someone who I connected with right at the end of my last effort, but didn't have any money to sort of pay to work with him. So he's been a real godsend this time around, and also working with John Collins from the
mhm,
CGDC
mhm.
community. He's
Yeah.
been doing some the coding for us, and um, artists and people. So there's quite a few people who things like that where I just didn't have those connections. Like,
Yeah.
um, yeah, but also I suppose some of the things that I've learned. Um, I spent a lot. I wasted so much time last time trying to find an artist, trying to find musicians or whatever. Because in
Mm,
my mind, that's what made a computer game, was beautiful artwork and
mm,
things like that. And I wasted so much time. I wasted quite a lot of money, to be honest. Like, not always even my own money either, like getting some concept art, which I look back and I think,
Yeah.
why did I even go near concept art when I'd never prototyped the game. I didn't, I think that's been the big learning curve, even with this game, sort of very quickly moved towards concept art and stuff. And I'm like, I should have just focused on prototyping the game using stickmen and wireframes and just work out, is it any good? And then, because you don't even know what concept art you need until you've
Yeah,
kind of.
exactly.
And it felt like it would have been a sort of long way round
Yeah.
to build smaller things. It felt like, but that's delaying what I really want to do, which is to build the big kind of dream project. But I do think I could have shortcutted a lot of the process if I had learnt some of those lessons sooner. If I just sort of picked a smaller game, learnt some of those. Well, because apart from anything else, it's through launching projects that you kind of gain more of a reputation as well, and then it becomes easier to get people on board because a bit easier to get people to take you seriously if you've got a proven track record. And I think I would have learnt some of the like how to do animation or how to, yeah, more creative
Yeah.
ways to tell a story. I think there's so many, like, a point and click adventure game is one fantastic way of telling a story, but actually there are some fantastic, much simpler games that also tell stories. So I think, with a bit more vision, I could have I could have found other ways to get into that world, I think. Yeah.
When I've had to lay down my dreams, it's kind of been a tender spot, right? I think you said you didn't have interest for a while, or you couldn't necessarily think about. I know for me, it's one of those things that you kind of, I don't know, dance around. You kind of avoid a little bit because it's tender. When you thought about starting on Serpent and the Seed, what was your conversation with God like? Were you talking to? Were you asking for permission, or what was that conversation like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think, yeah, I suppose this time I don't think I went in with this sort of quite such a strong sense of like, this is what God wants me to do with my life.
Mm.
Um, I think it was more of a like, okay, God, I've got an afternoon. I'm going to spend this afternoon and just try and come up with. I pretty quickly latched onto this idea of um, wanting to do a Bible overview um,
Mm.
for people who don't read the Bible. That was like my sort of starting point, because I'd got really inspired by some research that had been done by the Bible Society here. They've surveyed 20,000 UK adults into attitudes to the Bible, and their big kind of headline stat was that 1 in 4 UK adults were kind of open to reading the Bible. Um, but they also identified some sort of impediments that stop them, like particularly not seeing the big picture of the Bible and how it fits together, not seeing how it's relevant. So that kind of I've been excited for a few years by that, and like seeing the need, seeing the opportunity, and thinking games could be a great way to help with that. And so I I had this afternoon. I said, right, okay, God, I've got an afternoon. I'd like to try and come up with a kind of what would be a kind of 4 or 5 act structure for a Bible overview. Um, and and I opened a Word document and started typing. And by the end of the afternoon, I'd come up with I think it was 5 acts initially, but like a 5-act Bible overview. And I was like, all right, well, that felt quite straightforward. That's probably like the first 2 years of the previous development, right there in an afternoon. And so I think step by step, I reached out to Dan Gould, this game designer. I said, look, I've got this idea. Do you want to chat about it? And we met, and he was like, oh yeah, I'd love to work on this. It sounds really fun. But I think within a month he'd kind of sketched out the shape of Act One, like basically the Garden of Eden in the fall, where you meet Adam, and yeah, we'd kind of prayed together every time we met to chat about stuff. And so it was all done sort of in prayer, in conversation with God.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I had at any point necessarily this sort of, this must happen, and this is, I suppose that perhaps that had been a learning of like, let's just knock on this door and kind of see what happens. I suppose the first really big milestone was like having to raise our first bit of funding of like, if we're going to pursue this, I'm going to need to raise a bit of money. And we applied for a grant. Someone put us onto this website that gave sort of, I think it was they gave 10k sort of seed funding to innovative evangelistic projects. And I filled out an application, and they approved it. They gave us the money, and I was like, well, that was easy. And I think, just we kept on knocking on different doors. Like I reached out to these musicians, Paul Bishop Hooper, and I said, I don't know if you do commissions, and you're probably not interested in computer games if you do, but we're trying to make this game about trees in the Bible. And they replied really quickly saying, oh, we'd love to be involved. Like, we'd just been thinking, wouldn't it be cool to make an album about trees in the Bible? It's like, wow, that's really,
wow.
I love those kind of little God incidences. But it felt so different from last time. Where last time at every single turn it had felt hard and like I wasn't getting anywhere. Mm-hmm. This time it just felt like at every turn things were coming together really naturally, really straightforwardly, and it just really felt like God was in it. And so yeah, it was really just really felt God's kind of presence with us, I suppose, as we worked on it. And everyone I shared the idea with seemed really excited by it. People seemed to sort of really see the potential and the opportunity and stuff. So
tell me about the shift kind of in tone. You said the Serpent and the Seed's a lot more poetic than your original idea.
Yeah, so I mean, it's still very kind of clearly a kind of Bible-based, Bible overview kind of project, but I think we're trying to really lean into the kind of imagery and the poetry of the Bible. So Adam and Eve, when they're kicked out of the garden, they like literally fall out of the garden, and it's a small example, but it's a sort of, it's not like literal historical narrative in that sense, but it is, it's kind of, it's trying to communicate what's going on, but in engaging your emotions a bit more. And I think the music has turned out to be a really kind of, I quite early on I thought it would be really great to have some songs in this game. I sort of wanted one song per chapter, and it's been an absolute dream working with Paul Bishop Hooper, because they really specialize in writing songs based on the scriptures, and they have this real kind of anointing. Like it's their music is just out of this world. But so they've written a song for each of the key turning points, and again it's very kind of poetic, and like it gives the whole game this really kind of amazing quality. So yeah, it's a kind of, I think early on it's been really inspired by the secular game called Sword and Sorcery, which came out on the iPad with brand new in 2011, and but more than anything from that game, it was just the tone and feel of that game that I was aiming for. Like there's something really, again, like quite otherworldly about it. You feel like
Yeah.
this is something special, and it's quite hard to define, put your finger on. But it's not it's quite a silly game in certain places. The script is a bit daft at times, but so it doesn't take itself too seriously. But at the same time, the sort of it's quite weighty, and you feel like this is something, yeah, unusual. And I love that quality to it, because I was like, that's kind of what I'm trying to capture. Like the Bible is
Hmm.
the thing I started with, is just this feel, basically. The Bible is sort of electric, almost like it's a bit dangerous to read it. People get thrown into prison for owning Bibles, and like it's going to change your life potentially to read this thing, and it's accessible, and anyone can just open. It's just opening the book. It's just reading in one sense, but it's also there's a danger and an excitement to it, and that's kind of what I wanted to capture in this game. And yeah, so when we finally kind of shared our very first demo of chapter 1, I I knew that we'd succeeded, when it just felt like we'd kind of caught that tone and feel, I think. So there's plenty of details that need working out still, but it's like
Hmm.
the important quality is it feels right. And yeah, it was really exciting.
So last year, you also posted a video. It was a really fantastic video talking about narrative dissonance within games, and specifically, you're talking about what you were doing in your game, The Serpent and the Seed. What are some pitfalls game developers need to look out for when they're thinking about turning the Bible stories into games?
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a hobby horse of mine for most of these sort of 20 years, trying to make Bible games. But I think it's like we all have the story we're trying to tell through our game, and if it's a Bible story, it's probably a particular Bible passage we have in mind. Um, but what often gets neglected is this idea of the ludo narrative, which is the sort of implicit story that your game is perhaps subconsciously kind of communicating through the gameplay itself. So I think the example I used in my video is like Mario Kart. The kind of the ludo narrative behind Mario Kart is that going faster is better, and to be first is best, and like that's not kind of spelled out in the dialogue. It's not like an explicit narrative, but it is like really really clear from the gameplay. So it's a ludo narrative, and uh, yeah, I think like when people take Bibles, it seems to happen particularly with Bible stories. You take a Bible story, and the most sort of obvious way to turn it into a game is like you you cast yourself as the main character. So the kind of there's a million games where you are Moses and you're trying to kind of lead the Israelites out of exile. Not exile. What am I talking about? Anyway, out of Egypt. Um, and or like you are David and you're fighting Goliath, and I think we're always being taught at church about the sort of like we're not the hero of the story, like God is, and the story of David and Goliath isn't really about us and how great, how we can slay the giants in our life if only we have enough faith. It's really about like David isn't just any old Israelite; he's God's anointed future king, and we're more like the Israelites with knees knocking on the sidelines, like in need of a savior. And I think the trouble is, particularly, let's take a David and Goliath game. Like the most obvious kind of translation to a game is you've got some kind of slingshot and you kind of, you swing it around to gain power, you aim it, you time it perfectly, and then you shoot your stone. And if you manage to get it when Goliath's shield is down, then you win. And my son played one of these. There is like one of my all-time favorite Bible games is a David and Goliath game, Righteous Tales, which I think is a brilliant game in so many ways. But my son came away from it and he was running around the house cheering, and he was like, I killed Goliath first time. I killed Goliath first time. And I was like, well, great, good for you. But like, the story of David and Goliath isn't like how brilliant we are. Like it's about, like, David goes into it saying the Lord saves not by sword and spear. Like, it's not about how kind of skillful we are or how strong we are. He goes in trusting that it's God who's going to deliver him. And when, if you fail to kill Goliath, you're like really despondent and sad, like, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough. Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? David wasn't strong enough, but God was able to use him anyway. And so I think, yeah, if we are like too naive in the way we take a Bible story and translate it into game format, like, you end up actually kind of teaching almost the opposite point from what the Bible passage was trying to teach.
Yeah.
I think, to go back to that earlier idea, like, I think we're not the hero of a story, and we used to talk about Moses is me syndrome, that, like, I want to be the hero of a story, but, like, actually, and I think games so often kind of lean into that and reinforce that kind of, what I would say is an unhelpful way of reading the Bible. So yeah, I even from that earliest project, you weren't Saul, you were his little manservant. Going, I used to love kind of reading the passage, and you often find these kind of minor characters in the narrative who, like, it was Saul traveling with his manservant to look for his lost donkeys, or when David is invited to go and play the harp for Saul in his court, there's just like some random stranger who suggests, "Oh, there's a chap called David. Why did we get him to play the harp?" And I was kind of trying to find all those little minor characters and basically construct a narrative where you were that person, and like this sort of slightly removed external observer. And yeah, I've always felt that that's a more helpful way to approach a Bible game. That, like, you are not the hero, but you're kind of witnessing events and meeting the heroes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big problem. Is it when you play the hero, potentially you could change the outcome of the story, right? If you're not careful. Like, take a David and Goliath game, for example. If you somehow fail to hit him in time, or however it's set up, the story's changed.
Yeah. And they make a good joke out of that in Righteous Tales. I think there's like a line like, "Oh, that's not how the story goes," but yeah, it always feels a bit unsatisfactory. Like, I suppose, especially, there are so many Bible stories that ultimately are about how God is sovereign and God is in charge, and the whole point the Bible passage is trying to teach is trust that you can't, like, God can't lose. But then if the whole game can be lost, you're like, well, that's really awkward. And I suppose that it was in part was the appeal of the point and click adventure game, is that often ultimately you can't really change the outcome of the story. And some people hate that about those games and much prefer ones with, like, branching narratives and alternative endings, and I'm sure that could be done well as well. But personally, I rather liked the kind of fact that the kind of main structure of the story was sort of pinned in place, and as the sort of author of the story, we could make sure it panned out the way it was supposed to.
Why do you think the ludonarrative dissonance is, like, so common?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part it is just a neglected concept. So, like, lots of developers never heard of the idea. I'd never heard of the idea when I set off on this adventure. Secondly, it's really hard.
Yeah.
So we've tried to do this well with the Serpent and the Seed, and it has made life 10 times harder for ourselves. Like, the first idea we come up with is always much easier, but you're like, oh, but it doesn't really work. So the thing is, when you're doing like a David and Goliath game, you want there to be drama, and you want there to be tension, and you want that sort of sense of will they, won't they, like that is what you need, that in a game, don't you? Like, if there's no stakes, you have no emotional investment. And so, or Adam and Eve eating the fruit, like, it's the same problem. Like, you want the player to feel like there's a lot on the line here, and like what's gonna get, but it's really 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 hard to do. I think that's why this project has taken as long as it has, because we've had to sort of put a lot more time and thought and prototype it. We've tried, I've tried at least 4 or 5 different iterations of that, like the knowledge of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, that moment in Genesis 3. And um, I hope we're kind of getting closer now, but it's sort of, yeah, it's certainly not for the faint-hearted. I think trying to, I mean, it's much easier to just like, okay, let's come up with a story, let's come up with some fun gameplay, and they may be completely unrelated, and we'll sort of squash them together, and hey presto, there's a game. You know, you can do that very easily, but it's harder to come up with games. And you know, that's one of the things you worked on, that Dragon Cancer, didn't you, Brock? And like,
Yeah.
there's moments in that which really stood out to me as like moments that did this so well, like where the gameplay really kind of reinforces the kind of the story, or the kind of, and it just, when those moments happen, you can tell you've experienced something different, and like it just engages you in a completely, on another level.
I came across this really fascinating study recently. We've all heard the saying that actions speak louder than words. But there's a psychologist that has been studying this for years, and they came up with this. It's called the 7-38-55% rule. And what they found out, that in a conversation like this, we're communicating, only 7% of what's communicated to you is actually coming through what I'm saying, the actual content. 38% comes through my tone, and then 55% comes through my body language and facial expressions. And so I've just been thinking about that in terms of like games too, like it's that ludonarrative dissonance, right? The mechanics aren't communicating the same message as what the other parts of the game. I think it's tied into that somehow. I'm thinking about, but actions do really speak louder than words. But I think a lot of people are really focused on um, just the message, I guess. You know, I mean, they feel a tremendous amount of pressure to almost put a sermon into the game, right? And so,
You know, at the end of the day, it's got to be a game, hasn't it? Like
yeah.
you like, it's always been my passion to teach the Bible through a game, but it has to be a game. Like what's the point of making it a game if you're not maximizing the kind of things that are unique to games, and that interactivity and stuff is obviously a huge part of that. And if it's just sort of sermon wrapped up in some game packaging, why not just have a sermon?
Yeah. Jonathan Blow talks about that a lot. He talks about like, if I wanted to tell a story, I'd write a book. And the stuff that he does is like, he's very explicitly, like you said, like, what is special about a game? Why does this need to be a game rather than a sermon or a book or an essay or whatever?
His design reboot talk was quite
Yeah.
influential for me early on in this project, because he talks about how all games teach, like you've got within the kind of realm of that world, of that game, you know, it has certain rules, and they are kind of truth for the duration of that game. And so like he says, all games teach, but the question is like, what are they going to teach? And I've just found that was really interesting, coming from a kind of secular
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
game designer. Like,
Yeah.
even he's saying like, games are teaching you things, and the big question is, like, are we going to be teaching things that are beneficial for people, or and what could be better than teaching, you know, things that are eternally true, and like, the things of God. So um yeah, it was cool to hear that coming even from a non-Christian.
Yeah. So you're 3 years into development. What advice do you have for people wanting to make a Bible-based game? And I'm specifically curious, like when you're thinking about making a segment of your game, like, how are you approaching that? Are you praying about it beforehand? Are you reading the scriptures different, multiple times? Are you seeking out, trusted sources? What kind of process are you going through?
Yeah, yeah, and in some ways, I think if I were to have those 3 years over again, my process would probably be a bit different. But yeah, I mean, we've tried to do everything saturated with prayer. I think that is
Mm-hmm.
definitely been the starting point. I sort of pray regularly with our artists and musicians and things, and uh, so yeah, trying to, because yeah, I suppose Psalm 127 has always been really important to me. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain.
Yeah.
I think like you could pour so much time into something and just get nowhere if God's not in it. So yeah, we've tried to start with prayer. I think it's always worth reading the Bible passage one more time. I think like we so easily read the Bible through the lens of what we expect to find there, and
Mm-hmm.
like if I say how many of each animal did Noah have on the ark, we all instinctively want to say two, but like if you actually read it, the clean animals, he brought 7 pairs of
Yeah.
animals, so that's like 14, isn't it? And like we just don't imagine there being 14 sheep and 14 like this, that, and the other. So um, like, and I mean that's one of the things I did love about trying to make a game on 1 Samuel. I just read that book over and over again, and I was always discovering new like connections or new kind of characters. And I mean, the Bible is such a rich book, isn't it? And that like there's always more to discover. But yeah, we've also tried to read, like listen to other resources, and so for me, I think quite early on I was sort of spotted that there was these trees in all of these. So many of these Bible stories seem to involve trees. And I sort of said online, like, has anyone ever read a good biblical theology of trees in the Bible? And someone put us onto the Bible Project, who'd done a series called the Tree of Life, and talking all about like how their kind of hypothesis was that every major turning point in the Bible there's a tree, and I was like, wow, this sounds. I mean, it was really fascinating. Like,
Fascinating.
it blew my mind, like listening to their podcast, and obviously you've got the Tree of Life and the what they call the Tree of Testing in
Yeah.
Eden, and the Tree of Life comes back at the end of the Bible in Revelation 21, 22. Um, uh, so many of Abraham's big decisions happen by trees. Like
Yeah.
you've got these oaks of Mamre and the various other things. But I was like, well, what about David and Goliath? Like, where's the trees and that? But then, David and Goliath takes place either side of this place called the Valley of Elah.
Mm.
And I was like, well, let me look up what is Elah. And sure enough, it's terebinth. So, like, I suppose the image is this big valley with trees in the bottom. And
Yeah.
there you go. Um, Jesus, obviously, cursed as
Yep.
the man who hangs on a tree. So that was that was mind blowing for me, and really informed then the sort of shape of the rest of the project. So yeah, I love listening to that series, and they recommended a few books as well on the topic as well. So and also like alongside it, I suppose quite early on, as I said, I had that kind of idea about how owning the Bible can be a bit dangerous, and people are kind of thrown into prison, and that. So I've tried to do a lot of reading as well about like the sort of persecuted church, and
Mm.
there's an excellent book called I think it's Killing Fields, Living Fields, about the church in Vietnam, I think, during the reign of Pol Pot, and yeah, that was kind of in one sense completely something totally unrelated superficially to a Bible overview, but I think really helpful to sort of expand my horizons a bit in that. And subsequently, I've read another fantastic book about that promise in Genesis 3 of like the seed of the woman who'll crush the head of the seed of the serpent, but
Mm-hmm.
in particular how that's why that has been particularly relevant to the persecuted church through the ages,
Mm.
and like specifically connecting that kind of thread through the Bible with the persecuted church. I found that really bit of a sort of vindication almost of like it's not just coincidence that I've sort of thought that this relates to that theme of persecution, and like it's actually it's sort of intrinsic in
Yeah.
you've got that ongoing animosity between the
Yep.
seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and like that kind of persecution is almost part and parcel of that promise. And so it's been it's been helpful to sort of read more widely, not just the specific passages and things that I'm focused on. In terms of process, then, like I think, so reading it, what we found works for us is we've settled on quite a sort of stable process now, where so we start by reading the Bible, but then start with doing sort of basic sort of storyboarding, like what are the kind of key things happening, like so you meet Adam and you're going to help him name some animals, and then you don't find a helper fit for him, so and then he has a dream and Eve gets created and things like that. So we tried to sort of roughly storyboard those kind of key moments, which
Okay.
often comes out fairly abstract, like like, doesn't tell you anything about how many animals or which animals or like where do you meet the animals, but
And
you're like,
storyboarding would be different than like concept art, right? You said you were jumped to concept art too soon. This is at just
yeah
kind of a higher level.
yeah. So the storyboard, I mean, like for the Garden of Eden, in the end, like we had a storyboard that was basically here's a bunch of interactive elements that'd be really fun. So like here's a
Okay.
chameleon that will change color when you tap on it, or a whale that will spurt water when you tap on it, and or a spider that goes where you tap. And it's quite abstract in one sense, and it's not saying this is what it will look like, but more this is roughly how it will function. And
Okay.
and what I've learned, like the hard way, is really like that's enough to just get on and prototype it. Like so, in 2 minutes, really, I can throw together a prototype of a. I just cut out the artwork from that prototype of a chameleon, and then when you tap it, it changes color with a little sound effect. And like immediately, I was like, "Oh, this is really fun! Oh, I'm gonna keep tapping this chameleon and watch it change color." And like, I didn't need any outside help to do that. Like, I didn't need an artist or like. You could very quickly discover which things were going to work, which things were going to be fun, and but then I think prototyping it as early as possible is definitely my big kind of learning point on this. And then but then we've done this sort of, that's where I've got our concept artist involved, who's done a bit of a level design thing of, okay, here are the different elements, and now let's make it a bit more concrete. Okay, so you're going to start in this sort of wooded glade, and that's where you'll find the spider's web, and then we'll go into this sort of slightly more open scene, and that's where you'll find the chameleon and the sloth and things like that, and then you'll meet Adam at the top of the hill. And so our concept artist has helped take these sort of slightly abstract storyboards and turn them into a really concrete, like this is the shape of the level, and like there'll be a cliff here, and then you'll walk down, and there's a tree, and things like that. So
and what's
and
the state of the art at that point? Is it still pretty?
Yeah, I mean, even in that, like he would do those storyboards super like rough. So I mean, it's been interesting how like in the end, our kind of the actual artist we've started working with this year, it's only right at the end of this process. So we spent like 2 years prototyping the whole game in that really rough stickman form, and it felt like hard going at times. But by the end of those 2 years, I was like, this, we've now basically got a whole game, and it makes sense, and you're much less emotionally attached to it because you built it so quickly. Like that bit just doesn't work, or that bit's a bit boring, or and sometimes it's probably just because our prototype is not quite with the real music and the real art. It might actually be better, but I think the trouble is if you build like really high quality art and stuff too soon, you become so attached to it, and you're like, oh, I can't throw that scene out because it's got amazing
precious
music. Yeah, exactly. I spent months building that. So whereas what you want in that prototype stage is just, you don't want any attachment. You just want to be able to say, no, that bit doesn't work, let's kill it, or like but then we brought an artist on board this year. We've just been able to go through scene by scene by scene, like, okay, well, let's draw all of those things, let's draw a proper chameleon and a proper log and a proper sort of pond or whatever. And but yeah, our artist has worked from those really rough sketches that our concept artist did, but he's really loved actually that he's found that a really helpful like inspiration of. I don't know whether our level designer really intended them to be sort of so close to the final kind of shape almost, but he threw them together in a matter of hours, I think. But it's been really interesting to see how they kind of survived into the final shape of the thing.
So is music last, or how does that the gameplay and stuff is pretty tied to the music? When does that come in?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, if I had my time again, I might have left some of the music a bit later because, like,
Okay.
yeah, it's hard to with music. You really kind of you need to know how long the scene is going to be and how like what's the duration of the but yeah, for some of like the songs in particular in our game, like the song really almost came first, and then we constructed a game around it almost. So
Okay.
like for those I think for those key ones, I think I knew pretty early on what I wanted the songs to be about. So I knew that first one was going to be Genesis 3, the curse, but ending with that promise. The seed, your seed will crush the head of the serpent. And with chapter 2, we got a song about Abraham and Isaac going up Mount Moriah, and just that real wrestle of faith of God, like what you're doing, like you promised me all these things, but I don't have any children, and now I do have one son, and you're asking me to sacrifice him, and that kind of it's a real moment of testing, like for Adam and Eve at the tree, really like Abraham's being tested in his faith there, and will he trust God? And so I knew that would be a good basis for a song. And I mean, in chapter 3, we've settled on the Isaiah 53, like with the crucifixion, but Isaiah 53 starts with that kind of tree kind of language of like a root out of dry ground. But again, it's got quite a real kind of explanatory power of like what's going on at the cross, that Jesus was pierced for our transgressions, and and then chapter 4, like Revelation 22, where they're sort of back at the tree of life in the new creation, and some really cool kind of imagery about Jesus, like lots of I am sayings, and but an invitation to come all who are thirsty and drink. And so yeah, really excited for that. So with those ones, we've definitely started with the song, and then we've been like, okay, let's kind of construct a game around it. But a lot of other music, it's partly a matter of time. Actually, we had to start early so that it could all get. It's they can only write so many songs per year, really. So, but for other, if you've got the chance, I think in some ways it's beneficial just to wait and music get your music done at the end. But one of the things that is one of the advantages of having some of the music early is I was able to reach out to. I said how Sword and Sorcery was such a big influence on the Serpent Seed, and the music is what makes Sword and Sorcery what it is, and that's all by a guy called Jim Guthrie. And quite early on, I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if we can persuade Jim Guthrie to write a song for the Serpent and the Seed. So last summer, after I'd been to CGDC, I made a video about that and the sort of the scene there, and where I sort of there's a sort of slightly more retro computer game moment in the Serpent and the Seed. I thought I can imagine Jim Guthrie's kind of chip tune style music working really well there. So I reached out to him. I said, it's probably a long shot, but we're making this game about trees and the Bible, and like I'm a massive fan of Sword and Sorcery. It would mean so much to me if you'd be willing to write, if I could commission a track. And again, he wrote back and said, oh, it's not a long shot at all if you're willing to pay me. I'd love to. So we've got his really cool original Jim Guthrie track where he's taken one of Paul Bishop Hooper's themes, the sort of Moses music, and then he's sort of done a sort of chip tune.
Wow, that's awesome.
Sort of inspired and the starting of that. So that's been a real kind of dream come true to have him involved in a small way. So and that that was only possible because we had time to play with. Like he's quite a busy guy, so he said, as long as I can have as many months as I need to get around to it.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So where are you in development right now? And do you have like a tentative release date?
Yeah, so we have built loads of the kind of most of the key kind of turning points through the game.
Okay.
We've got a lot of blanks to fill in. So and we haven't built any of chapter 4 yet, which is like the new creation, sort of the end of a story. So yeah, we haven't sort of publicly committed to a release date yet. I'm hopeful that by the end of this year we'll be in a good place. But from time to time, I'm like, I sort of think, oh gosh, there is still an awful lot left to do. But I think what I've learned, massive thing I've learned, is deadlines are really helpful, and they focus the mind. So if you say it's going to ship on this date, then like sure you may have to cut some stuff out, but some of that stuff may not have been that important after all. So at some point we will commit to a release date. But yeah, right now we're working towards we're going to our first sort of secular games convention in just over a week's time, a week on Monday, Pocket Gamer here in London, and I'm really excited for that because I think that's our first sort of test of how does a non-Christian audience react to it, and but we've got an awful lot we want to get built before then, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, so we even though we haven't like got the final release date, we've tried all the way through. We've tried to have these sort of mini deadlines where we can share bits publicly with a slightly wider audience, and that's been absolutely invaluable for us. So yeah.
So where can people go to find out more about your game?
So the website is serpentseedgame.org, or we're on. You can find me. I'm Andy Geers on YouTube, or Serpent Seed Game on Twitter or Instagram, TikTok, you name it. But if you go to serpentseedgame.org, that's where we've got our monthly email newsletter, and that's kind of the best place probably to stay in the loop.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for chatting.